Well, hello again, friends. Today, as we in the United States are approaching the 2018 election cycle, and everyone's telling us, not everyone, but each side of the partisan divide is going to their base and going to people and saying, get out and vote, get out and vote. It's going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference. It's really important that you vote. I want to talk about the deeper problem with government. In part, this is a conversation I had with some good friends who have quite a bit of experience with government a few weeks ago, and in part, at the time, rereading Franklin Merrill Wolf's chapter in his book, Pathways Through to Space, called The Problem with Government. So I'm amalgamating or mixing many different ideas from different sources, which is always true anyway. The United States Constitution is a remarkable document. It tries to find a way to balance different aspects of power. There's three branches of government: judiciary, executive, and Congress. Other systems are similar and different. The thought that went into the Constitution was profound and remarkable. But the problem, even with an excellent document or an excellent structure, is that it's human beings who are going to implement it. And therefore, we're always coming back to the issue of the consciousness of the individuals. And in this instance, as we come to an election cycle, there are the ones that are going to be elected and the electors, the ones that cast their vote. And if the consciousness of the electors, those of us that are voting, is deep, we're going to recognize that kind of depth and support that kind of depth in a candidate that we would wish to elect. In turn, the candidate is appealing to, from their consciousness, his or her consciousness, appealing to the consciousness within ourselves, within the electors, the ones whose support the candidate is wanting. And so you see that the system always revolves around consciousness. And what happens with the professional politician is that the largest base that votes is often voting without a great deal of self-awareness. They're already caught up in stories about their religion, about their jobs, about the national boundaries, about immigrants, about terrorism. Terrorism kills so few people in the world. The only thing about terrorism is are you going to let them capture your mind? Because very, 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 very few people are ever going to be harmed by terrorism. Terrorism is the act of weakness. And so, yet, if you can inflame fear, then terrorism is a really important subject. If you inflame fear, you're appealing to the most basic level of emotion in a person. So now you have an electorate, or the ones that cast the vote, the electors, who are being instigated to fear and distrust and partisanship by the candidate. So the candidate becomes a professional manipulator of the worst and lowest impulses in the vast majority of people, and they in turn will only recognize you as a candidate if you are a mirror for their separatist, insecure, fear-based mode of consciousness. And so the problem with government always is that the kind of people who could truly be true leaders are generally going to go into the world and find success in some other area, usually some sort of economic pursuit. And so we have billionaires that have created products and corporations, organizations that are affecting all of our lives, and they often have tremendous administrative skills. They have to constantly work with people because the success of their organization depends on how they treat people to some extent. And some corporations are better at that than others. But the point is, those people will have a tremendous indirect influence on government, but they're not going to put themselves up for election because of the craziness of what it does. No matter what you say, you're always going to gain the approval of some people and gain the criticism of someone else. Nobody's able actually to look past the stories, a subject that I talked about in the previous video. How many layers of stories we're caught up in. And so we basically have to accept that this is the challenge. That I'm just looking at my notes, that the still small voice of consciousness whispers, and fear screams, shouts. A philosopher, a mystic, somebody capable of embodiment of deep human values, let's just choose someone well-known like the Dalai Lama, stays within only a spiritual religious context, even though if that kind of person could be a leader, if we could have voted for that kind of person, think about the consciousness that we'd be voting for, think about the consciousness we'd be voting from. And it's really painful to know that often you don't really have a choice. That the choice that you make is between extremes of one form of idealism and another form, one form of philosophy and another form, the story of socialism, the story of communism, the story of democracy, the story of the Republican Party in the United States or the Democratic Party in the United States. And instead of some unifying vision, the problem with government is that it's based on polarization, and it's now in a spin or a cycle that seems, or it feels to us because we're alive in it, to be profoundly deepening, becoming more polarized. But I'm not sure it's true. I think it's always been true that we were polarized. So what can you do? The only thing you can do is do your best not to sink into the morass of darkness. Vote for who you want to vote for, but don't feel like you're voting for someone who will save you. There is no savior. Vote with your heart open, and if your candidate isn't elected, keep your heart open anyway. If things get worse and worse in terms of polarization, feel the sorrow of that, because it would be like watching someone you love, your own children, polarize themselves into unhappiness. We are not separate from each other. It's agonizing to see the misery and pain people on either side of any polarized point of view are creating in themselves. I don't know how deep that suffering has to go. The system itself spirals into the lowest common denominator unless somehow we individually live lives that change that. And it's no longer valuable or useful to call it a spiritual path. It's a path in life. If that spiritual path is separate from your politics, separate from your behavior, it doesn't work. And I'll just tell you a small story from my own life, Kathy and my own life. We have what's called an HOA, a homeowners organization association here. So the collection of homeowners in this neighborhood together regulate certain things like the painting of the buildings on the outside, the maintenance of the buildings on the outside. We pay money into this every month, every owner does. And recently, as we approached the 10-year point for these houses, a law firm came from the outside and simply said, oh, in a few more months, there'll be no obligation any further on the part of the builders to take care of any problems in the building. So let us send in our engineers and our evaluators and examine your buildings and find out if there are any problems, and let's sue the builders now to make sure they're going to repair these problems or will be obligated to repair these problems when the 10 years expire. And so a group of homeowners came together, and lo and behold, with fear started by a law firm that has people that don't live here, they simply saw in the records that this community was approaching 10 years old. They knew the laws in this particular county, in this particular state, that the obligation of the builder ends after 10 years, blah, blah, blah. And they appealed to fear. They appealed to the chance to get themselves hired and make money, and then create their consultants, their engineers to bill us. And nobody could have a rational conversation. Nobody. Kathy tried to stand up and say something, and she was shouted down. In the end, they listened to one of the residents who was a lawyer, who basically ended up sanctioning the lawsuit, even though he knew what it was going to end up doing. And we spiraled into, there was no trust. There was just distrust. There was name calling. There was shouting over each other. And this is 30 people in a room. This is what happened. This is what happens everywhere. And if you walk into that and you make the best statement you can make about what your values are, and maybe you decide to work with the builders, to create trust with them, to create handshake agreements, to rely on each other's integrity, then we begin to spiral into trust, into integrity, into shared responsibility. We start to call out the best in each other, but what we did with our HOA was call out the worst in ourselves and ruin our relationship with the builders, who have been very cooperative and very supportive of all of us ever since these buildings were created. This is what happens with government. This is the problem with government of the people, because the consciousness with which each individual participates is so involved with self-interest and so involved with fear. And that's the great disease, self-interest and fear. And it is heartbreaking. And even though it's heartbreaking, there is no other choice to make than to grow in love and to grow in consciousness. No other choice that gives your life any true meaning. So I urge you to continue, be part of the world, and find your way to no story. Find your way to heart. Let your mind be in service to your heart. That's the only thing we can do. Blessings. Wherever you are, do your best.